Carly Ryan was born on January 31, 1992 in Australia. At that time, her mother, Sonia Ryan, was only 20 years old and she was raising Carly on her own. They lived in a place called Stirling, a suburb of Adelaide, in South Australia. Carly and Sonia were always very close. They were like a support system for each other. When Carly entered her teenage years, her relationship with her mother transformed. She began to share all her thoughts, doubts, and secrets with her. Without a doubt, Carly was a caring and sensitive girl. In addition, she was deeply drawn to various subcultures, and she shared her love for music and its aesthetics with those close to her. Along with friends she knew personally, Carly had many acquaintances on social media. She loved spending time on communities like MySpace and Vampire Freaks, where she interacted with people who, like her, belonged to similar subcultures such as goths. On MySpace, Carly was known by the nickname SYSL, and her posts certainly lived up to that name. They were nothing short of provocative. Most of the photos featured women tied up with ropes, as well as people using illegal substances. Among the alleged interests listed on her profile were drug use, smoking, alcohol, music, random screaming, intimacy, and concerts. Of course, most of these interests were merely fabrications and didn't reflect her real life. At some point, Carly's friend, Ashley, introduced her to a young man named Brandon Kane. He was born in the United States but lived in Victoria, Australia. According to him, he was 20 years old, and his favorite hobby was playing the guitar. Brandon was the first to write to Carly. Before that, he had only been talking to Ashley, as he was actually pursuing her. They mostly talked about everyday things, although sometimes they touched on rather intimate topics. Ashley never liked these kinds of conversations, and eventually their communication nearly stopped. However, when she posted a photo of herself with Carly, Brandon reached out again. He asked for Carly's email address. Soon after that, Brandon sent Carly his first message. After a brief exchange, Carly fell in love with her new acquaintance. The image of Brandon fit perfectly with her idea of the ideal guy. Their communication quickly took on a romantic tone. Along with chatting, they started talking on the phone. They kept in touch for over a year. Weeks passed, months went by, and their bond only grew stronger. Carly was absolutely captivated by him and believed he was the love of her life. She even told all her friends about him, and her mom. Of course, Carly's mom, realizing the potential danger of such communication, was cautious about her daughter's infatuation. It's unclear whether she knew Brandon's real age or not, but she definitely suspected that he might not be who he claimed to be. Sometimes, Sonia even peeked over her daughter's shoulder, especially when Carly was chatting with him. In fact, Sonia already had access to Carly's MySpace account. The conversations there never raised any red flags. They seemed quite innocent. But the same couldn't be said about the photos Sonia once found on Carly's account. They shocked her to the core, as they had a distinctly intimate nature. Sonia immediately shared her concerns with her daughter, but Carly reacted like a typical teenager. Although, sometimes even Carly noticed that Brandon acted a little off, and some of his behaviors made her feel uneasy. After all, the fact that a 20-year-old guy was communicating with a 14-year-old girl would raise concerns for any parent. But it wasn't just about his age. The things he asked her to do were rather strange. One time, Brandon asked Carly to kiss her friend, Ashley, and record it on camera. Carly agreed, only because she really liked Brandon. But her friend was much more cautious and started wondering if that video ended up on some inappropriate website. Soon after, Ashley found even more reasons to be suspicious. This happened right after she found out that Carly had started talking to a man named Shane, who, according to him, was Brandon's adoptive father. Like his son, Shane had a MySpace account. He claimed to be an honest security guard and a former military man. According to him, he even worked as a bodyguard for Marilyn Manson. Well, it seemed like he and his son shared more than just a love for music. They also appeared to have an unhealthy interest in younger girls. Shane often called Carly on the phone, even when she was spending time with her friends. Moreover, he would ask them inappropriate questions. For example, he would ask if they were bisexual or if they liked kissing other girls. Ashley was uncomfortable with all of this, and at one point she told Carly about it. But Carly's reaction was rather negative, and eventually the two friends had a falling out. It's worth noting that Carly had always wanted to meet Brandon in person. Their meeting was scheduled for January 26, 2007. Unfortunately, at the last moment, Brandon said he couldn't come. Instead, he told Carly that his father would visit her, and she happily agreed. Perhaps it wasn't just because Shane was Brandon's father, but by that time, the man had become something like a father figure to Carly herself. Of course, Sonia, Carly's mom, hesitated about letting a strange man into their home, but her daughter insisted. So in January 2007, a man who looked about 50 years old drove up to Carly and her mother's house in a light blue car. Shane was dressed in a security guard uniform, and somehow he immediately put Sonia at ease. In the end, she not only let the man into her home, but also allowed her underage daughter to go shopping with him. During their next visit to the shopping mall, Brandon's father bought Carly a lot of things. Most of the gifts were harmless, but some of them raised a few questions. In total, Shane spent over 400 Australian dollars. But all of this was just part of his scheme, because while Carly was trying on clothes, Shane was secretly watching her, trying to catch a glimpse of her naked body. During Carly's birthday celebration, she spent most of the time with her ex-boyfriend, and Shane wasn't too pleased about it. He felt that Carly wasn't giving him enough attention. Later that evening, however, Shane managed to win her over, and they went for a walk with her friend Rihanna. At one point, Shane tried to make the girls kiss each other, but Rihanna refused, and Carly ended up in tears, running back home. Another, much stranger event happened later that night. While Carly was asleep, Shane climbed into bed with her and whispered softly in her ear, "I love you so much. I won't let anything happen to you." The next morning, Carly told her mother everything. Sonia immediately lashed out at the man and kicked him out of their house. Later, Sonia asked her daughter if Brandon's father had touched her, and Carly said that he had. But Carly didn't want Brandon to know about it. She even asked her mom to talk to Shane and settle the situation. But Sonia was relentless. She wanted to cut off all contact between her daughter and these people immediately. Sometime later, Sonia wrote Shane a letter, demanding that he stop any further communication with her daughter. She also threatened to report him to the police if he didn't comply. The next message from the man was filled with rage. Shane claimed that Sonia's words were false and threatened to sue her. Even though Brandon's father was no longer in their home, Sonia understood that she and her daughter were still in danger. There was still a chance that Shane might try to contact Carly again. Interestingly, at this point, Sonia didn't even suspect that the man who had come to her house wasn't Shane at all. In fact, he wasn't a security guard or a former soldier, and he wasn't Brandon's father either. The person hiding behind both the father and the son's identity was one and the same. His name was Garry Francis Newman. But who was he? A woman, known to the Australian press as Christine, realized that her own home had become a prison after she married Garry Newman. Her husband sought total control over her life. According to Christine, Garry constantly beat her, almost for any perceived mistake. For example, if she wanted to go shopping with a friend or was late by just a few minutes, it would set him off. Moreover, Garry took all the money Christine earned. For the record, she worked at a strip club. When she refused to return to work, Garry forced her back with violence. One day, when Christine told her husband that she was going shopping with a friend, he dragged her into a room. Once inside, he pinned her down and began beating her. He did this until Christine lost consciousness. Only then did he stop and leave her lying in the middle of the room. By some miracle, Christine managed to crawl to the front door. Luckily, Garry's mother arrived at that moment. Seeing her daughter-in-law in such a state, she immediately called a doctor. After the examination, the doctor asked Christine if her husband had been beating her, but Garry's presence in the room prevented her from answering truthfully. Garry gripped her hand so tightly, he almost broke several of her fingers. In the end, Christine managed to escape and move to Melbourne. Garry, surprisingly, didn't seem too upset about her leaving. In fact, he felt liberated. Free to indulge in his darker desires, Garry became obsessed with adult films featuring women dressed as schoolgirls. Shortly after, he developed the urge to bring his violent fantasies to life. Before Garry began targeting Carly, he had several attempts at connecting with other girls. Each time, he created a new story, a new identity. Astonishingly, during this time, he made over 200 profiles on MySpace. From 2002 to 2003, using his home computer, Garry courted a 14-year-old girl living in the United States. He called her Princess, and sometimes even referred to her as his wife. Using the nickname Nesh, he also communicated with another girl from Singapore. He even flew there to meet her, but she deceived him and didn't show up. This deeply affected his mental state. Garry wrote to a friend that the girl would pay for her betrayal. His obsession escalated to the point where, at one time, he considered getting his own daughter, who was under 13 years old, intoxicated, and forcing her into an inappropriate situation. Thankfully, he never managed to carry out this horrific plan. In Carly's case, Garry hoped that she would be more accepting of his advances. He believed they could start a new life together. Garry even went as far as telling his colleagues about his plans to move to Adelaide. But once his intentions were discovered, he felt his dream slipping away. Losing the chance to interact with Carly as Shane, Garry decided it was time for Brandon to take over. He wanted to hurt the girl. It became his twisted, genuine desire. Garry had already lost all hope of a life with Carly, and from that point on, his mind was consumed only by revenge. Throughout February, the communication between Garry and Carly didn't stop. At one point, pretending to be Brandon, Garry suggested that Shane could visit Carly, and she agreed. All Garry needed to do now was find a young man willing to play the role of Brandon. The criminal was well prepared. It turned out that in the past, he had adopted a 17-year-old boy. This boy was to pretend to be Carly's love interest, Brandon. On February 19th, Garry and his adopted son headed to Adelaide. Carly had lied to her mother about her plans that day, telling her she would spend the night at a friend's house. Maybe, feeling guilty about the lie, Carly hugged Sonia several times before leaving and told her she loved her. When Carly slipped out the back door, the man she knew as Shane and the boy pretending to be Brandon were already waiting for her. Garry drove them to a town called Port Elliot, one of South Australia's most popular spots. They strolled around the town, and eventually, they made their way to a secluded cove. There, the man offered Carly some illegal substances. After 10 p.m., in a remote corner of the cove, Garry took advantage of Carly's altered state. He pushed her to the ground, face down, and then forced her into a terrible act. His adopted son helped hold Carly down during the assault. When it was over, Garry struck her head several times until she lost consciousness. Then, the man and his son threw their victim into the water, hoping she would drown. And tragically, that's exactly what happened. The next morning, a woman named Kim Griffin stumbled upon Carly's lifeless body. Kim desperately tried to call for help, but there was no one around. In a panic, she ran to the nearest parking lot, where she found a fisherman named Ian Slate, who agreed to assist her. Together, they pulled the girl's body onto the shore, but when they checked her pulse, they realized it was too late. Just minutes later, Kim called the police and rescue services. On February 20th, 2007, Carly was officially declared dead. The subsequent autopsy revealed that the girl had at least 19 injuries. Some of them were caused by blows to the head. Additionally, several cuts and scratches were found on her body. Traces of cannabinoids were detected in Carly's blood. According to the expert's report, the girl died shortly before Kim found her. The victim's body was identified by her mother. Without a doubt, the incident became a true catastrophe for her. The woman couldn't understand how Carly ended up in this place, so far from home. Surveillance cameras installed at Port Elliot showed that Carly was there in the company of two people. They were definitely men. In one of the frames, the trio was near the Crown Hotel, and in another, not far from a fast food restaurant. Investigators managed to collect statements from several witnesses. One recalled a man asking where he could get a drink. He suggested they head towards the bay. A cashier from a supermarket, who sold a pack of cigarettes to the man, said that he had asked the same question around 9 p.m. Carly, Garry, and his foster son were nearby the bay. Witnesses described the girl as looking either goth or emo. Some of the witnesses also mentioned seeing a light blue car with Victoria state license plates. According to them, the car was parked on one of the cliffs, and something resembling a security badge was lying on its dashboard. Investigators analyzed Carly's last calls to find out who she was talking to shortly before her death. One of the numbers was registered in Melbourne, another in Adelaide. The police tried to identify the owners of these phones, but they were unsuccessful. However, location data provided answers. It turned out that some calls were made from Ukerwillia, a suburb of Adelaide located several kilometers from Carly's home. There, a trailer park was found where people lived in their own vehicles. When investigators arrived, the light blue car with Victoria plates was no longer there. Several locals confirmed seeing both the car and the people inside. Surveillance footage helped identify the car and obtain information about the license plate. Tracing the number led to a house on the Mornington Peninsula, south of Melbourne. It belonged to a 48-year-old man named Garry Francis Newman. In fact, the wanted car was found right in front of his house. At that moment, Garry became the prime suspect in Carly's murder. When the police entered the house, the man was sitting at his computer, chatting with a 14-year-old girl from Western Australia. It turned out Garry was once again pretending to be Brandon. Only 11 days had passed since Carly's body was found in the bay, and the man was already looking for his next victim. During the search of his house, numerous items were found that directly linked him to his horrific and criminal activities. In notebooks, there were details of 200 fake identities Garry used to communicate with underage girls. Furthermore, there was evidence proving that the man was regularly engaging in cyberstalking. Carly's information was also found in his handwritten notes, next to the words, "Rest in peace, Carly Ryan." Additionally, the police discovered that Garry's shoes had sand from Port Elliot on them. Unfortunately, by this time, the man had already managed to delete many of the messages from his profile. The correspondence with Carly was also incomplete. However, recordings of phone calls with the girl were found on his computer, in particular conversations where he posed as Brandon. The last messages between Garry and Carly were exchanged shortly before her death. In these messages, they talked about meeting on the 19th. When experts compared the suspect's DNA with samples found on the deceased's clothing, they confirmed that the profiles matched. This proved that the man had been in contact with the victim and was at the beach on the day of her death. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Garry denied his involvement in the crime. He did everything in his power to shift the blame onto his foster son. However, the young man told a completely different story, accusing his father of everything. In the end, both suspects were arrested. The trial against them lasted almost 3 years. Throughout the proceedings, Garry continued to deny his guilt. For months, he blamed his son, insulted him, and called him a liar. The accused also claimed that the authorities and the media deliberately framed him. While in prison, he even wrote several letters to his relatives, asking them for help. Garry wanted them to support him and confirm his alibi. However, not only did his family refuse to help him, but they also informed the police about his requests. Until the very end of the trial, the details about the accused were kept under the strictest secrecy. The only information that was public was about Carly's identity. Initially, the media portrayed her as a troubled teenager. Some even blamed her, saying she sought a relationship with an adult man. These kinds of statements made the case notorious nationwide. The first court hearing took place on October 20, 2009, at the Supreme Court of South Australia. Even before the trial began, Judge Trish Kelly ruled certain evidence inadmissible, such as Garry's conversations with other teenage girls. She only considered the evidence that had a direct connection to Carly's case. The prosecution argued that the accused jointly controlled the profiles of Brandon and Shane. Garry's son's defense, on the other hand, claimed that the young man only helped his father cover up the traces of the crime. For a long time, Garry and his lawyers kept pointing the finger at his foster son, portraying him as the sole person responsible for Carly's death. However, in January 2010, when Garry took the stand, he shocked everyone by changing his story. The defendant claimed that neither he nor his son were guilty of the girl's death. According to Garry, he had never felt any special attraction toward Carly. He insisted their relationship was always more like that of a stepfather and stepdaughter. Moreover, the man stated that he couldn't feel attracted to anyone, as he was what he called asexual. In other words, he wasn't interested in intimacy, or so he said. According to Garry, the only person who had romantic feelings for Carly was his foster son. He claimed he was merely playing the role of Shane, while the young man pretended to be Brandon. The defendant also claimed that for a long time he had been obsessed with social media. He attributed this obsession to his bipolar disorder and obsessive-compulsive disorder. Garry explained that he invented the idea of conducting research that he claimed would help him write a book about manipulation in social media. Even though Garry denied that his actions caused Carly's death, he did admit to taking her away from his foster son to Port Elliot. In an attempt to defend himself, he said that the teenagers had been at a party in the city and only later reunited. After that, he and his son supposedly went home, leaving Carly alone on the beach. It seemed that by making such statements, the defendant was hoping for a verdict related to manslaughter. He tried to present everything as if the girl had harmed herself. However, the jury did not agree with his claims, and in the end, Garry Francis Newman was found guilty of Carly's murder. On January 21, 2012, the judge sentenced the man to life imprisonment, with no possibility of parole for 29 years. As for Garry's foster son, who was a minor at the time of the crime, all charges against him were dropped. His identity was never made public. After the trial ended, Sonia Ryan helped establish the Carly Ryan Foundation, which later became a nonprofit organization promoting internet safety. The death of her daughter under such circumstances would make any parent wary of social media, but for Sonia, the priority wasn't to stop young people from using the internet. It was to ensure they could feel safe online.
Thanks for watching, friends. What do you think about this story? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'm always interested in your opinions. Subscribe to my channel. There's much more to come. See you next time.